Bonjour, Kyle Indigenous, Jijak and Dodem, Bodwad Miandao, Shishibanya Kundabendagwes. I told you, you can call me Kyle. I'm Crane Clan, Potawatomi, the Oklahoma version. And I know we're getting started a bit late, and I just wanted to mention that I might abruptly stop my presentation at some point just so we stay on time. And I don't mean to be resentful or anything, but since I might have to stop early and I'm Crane Clan, which means I like to talk, it's kind of a violation of my clan responsibility. Kind of. But I did like watching y'all kind of slowly trickle in, because I was like, maybe I don't have to present after all. You know, kind of like when you wake up in the morning and there's snow outside and you're wondering, is school canceled? So I want to tell you all a little bit about my work on climate change. And I've got a couple of parts for the presentation. I want to first tell you about, why is it that I'm interested in climate change as a Potawatomi person? What is this issue of knowledge sovereignty, of our traditional knowledge in relation to climate change? And then, depending on how much time there's left, I want to get into climate justice and policy issues. So first of all, and don't worry if you can't process all the slides, because I kind of go through things quickly, but I'll be narrating. So when we refer to climate change, we're just referring to this idea that scientists for some time have been observing that there's been a rise in global average temperature. And that rise destabilizes the climate system, and it makes the climate and the environment do things that we're not used to, right? So you get more sea level rise, you get stronger storms, you get changes in precipitation, more severe droughts. And while Native people have been tracking this stuff for a long time, scientists have recently made a big impact in arguing that things are really changing very quickly. And as a Potawatomi person, right, I don't really see climate change and having to adapt to climate change as a new issue. Because when I think about our history, we were a people that lived along the Great Lakes. And in a lot of my work, I've tried to learn about and understand the type of lifestyle we lived. And it wasn't like the lifestyle in the United States. For one, we ranged over a large area, and where we lived depended on the ecosystems that we needed to survive. So we had a wide-ranging area, right? This is some of the land that we seeded. You can see it's enormous. And within that world that we lived in, we had a seasonal lifestyle. In the United States, they've got the same government all year round. It's a big clunky thing. It's not very tuned to the ecosystem. We had a whole bunch of different governing systems all year round, depending on what you needed to harvest, right? So here's a representation of our seasonal system, of our 13 moon system, and it varied from society to society, right? So this is from our Ojibwe relatives, Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, being part of a very similar group. And because our government changed all the time, it was very adaptive, right? And we knew a long time ago, the lesson, right, that you don't want like a village, fishing village, right, to descend on a sugar bush, right? You don't want the same social or political unit all year round, because our institutions and our societies have to be structured so they're the most adaptive possible to the changes that are going along around us. And so what really solidified these systems, and some of my early research with Nick Rio, we looked in this in detail, was that our ability to adapt was underlined by moral responsibilities that we had with other humans and non-humans. So it wasn't a system that was based on fines or tickets if you did something bad. It was actually based on a kind of understanding of mutual systematic responsibility. And this is just for white-tailed deer, but you can look at the moral systems that specifically belong to hundreds of different interactions with all sorts of different plants and animals. Now, for Potawatomi people, this was all going absolutely great since time immemorial, and then this happened. The trail of death. And so the U.S. forced us to take a long walk. We first went to Kansas, and that worked out for a little while. And then we went all the way down to Oklahoma, which was supposed to be for Indians only, but the U.S. didn't think that was a good idea, and they stuck us right here in the middle. You can see all the other Great Lakes tribes, with a few exceptions up in the corner, are all there in Oklahoma. And as many of you guys know, Oklahoma is not the prettiest place. But for me, as a scholar, it's been significant in my life to be part of this process of rebuilding our nation in a completely different climate region. Right? We literally had to go from the Great Lakes climate region to a totally different climate region in Oklahoma. and basically start from scratch. We had traditions that were attuned to a different environment, a different landscape. We've not only tried to restore those traditions, but have tried to learn ways to live in this new area. So in a lot of ways, we are the first climate change relocation survivors, right? So don't let anyone tell you that the US was never implicated in climate change adaptation, right? Forced climate adaptation until just recently. It goes back a long way. It's part of colonialism. And so this process of rapid adaptation to climate change with imposed a lot of harms, right? That's why we call it things like the Trail of Death. It fragmented us as Potawatomi people so that now we're all over the place, right? There's a whole bunch of different Potawatomi nations on both sides. And when my partner, Christy Dotson, got her job at Michigan State University, which was right by where you see the 3 there in the bottom of Michigan, I was like, please, take me with you. Take me with you. Because I wanted to work with other Potawatomi folks, right? And I wanted to engage in those landscapes that, if you're from Oklahoma, these are things you only hear about if you haven't had a chance to visit them. And so these are the landscapes that I love. And as I started having the chance to live here, I realized it wasn't just Native people that were concerned about environmental protection, it was other people of color. Black communities, Latino communities were concerned that they were living in some of those degraded environments, right, with higher rates of asthma hospitalization. So I teamed up with these folks to learn more about it. We formed a Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, and we've been doing events just like this. We have an environmental justice policy in Michigan, and it's all about building coalitions across different communities of color, Indigenous people that are equally concerned with the environment. Now for me though, personally, what's been most important was being back in the land means you can do those social, cultural activities that can only be done in these ecosystems. And so this has been a big part of my learning and my living in this land. And just as I was actually getting used to stuff, like just as I was getting my knocking stick technique down and kind of figuring out what to do and all of that, then my friend Robin Kimmerer told me about this, which was they're actually projecting that the climate in Michigan in 40 years or something like that is going to be the climate, is going to be like the climate in Oklahoma. And then when I learned that the US and the industrialized countries and the capitalists were actually the cause through their economic activities of human-caused climate change, I was like, they're going to do whatever they can to get all of us Anishinabes, right, in Oklahoma, right, and bring Oklahoma up here. And so I devoted myself to working on climate change issues, and I found out it wasn't just Anishinaabe people that are having to deal with what to do about this sort of human-caused climate change that we're experiencing now, this rapid destabilization that we're experiencing. To give you some examples, just here in the Great Lakes, right, we've got the 1836 treaty area. That area, right, has things like fishing allocations that are almost like little boxes. They're not things that are very adaptable. So tribes that are party to that treaty are concerned about whether those little boxes and allocations are going to be flexible enough so that when a fish population changes, in terms of where it lives, that you can still adapt and move outside of those boxes to be able to fish that population, right? So are the treaties actually going to be adaptable? Are they going to be flexible to these changes? Or are we going to think about having to renegotiate with a state or a province or a crown or federal entity that are not fun to negotiate with? The Nisquallies in the Pacific Northwest, they depend culturally and economically on salmon. Salmon habitat's affected by the glaciers because if it melts, it affects the stream temperature. They're literally watching the Nisqually Glacier recede and trying to deal with the fact that their culture, their way of life, their economy is actually in peril, right? Because the salmon habitat is degraded. The village of Kivalina in Alaska, among a number of other villages, is having to relocate permanently due to sea level rise. Permanent relocation for Potawatomi people, right, brings up a lot of memories, as it does for other tribes. And so they're having to undergo, the difficulties and the pains and the traumas, right, of having to move from one place to the other permanently. And there's also ways in which Native people are impacted by climate change that you might not initially think of, right? One problem a lot of tribes have in the United States is we got these weird Western-style government systems from the United States when they wanted to give us a government system that would help open up our lands for more extraction industries. But these are like totally fragmented. So here's one that my friends at Oneida of Wisconsin have presented on, right? That shows how their government's categorized and divided up, and health is separate from environment and natural resources. But climate change is like an integrated problem, right? You can't talk about climate change as, this is the natural resource aspect, this is the health aspect. They're all together, right? They're all bound up. So these styles of government that we have to use, unfortunately, while the US recognizes them as sovereign, they're not the greatest for adapting to change. The ones that we had historically, the seasonal systems, depending on what tribe you were just far better. And another problem with these governments, shifting in general, right, not on Oneida, is that because they're Western, almost all the people in staff and leadership roles, they're all dudes, right? It's all men. And that's just a totally different understanding of gender, right? It's a patriarchal gender system when many of our societies do not subscribe to that way of thinking about gender. And still, too, for many tribes, it's also a part of being impacted by climate change when you're living right next door to a place where they're extracting a lot of fossil fuels. I know some people are going to talk about tar sands and other things of that kind later today, so I'm not going to cover that in too much detail. Right, but here, right, you've got the major, oil and gas basins and so on. They're shipping stuff across tribal land. All of you guys know in the Arctic, all of the oil and gas exploration are doing there. That degrades the environment, makes it harder to live your life. And what we've also seen from literature is that when these extractive industries come in, they create these man camps. And what do the man camps do, right? They traffic people, oftentimes Native women, Native children. And so friends of mine like Victoria Sweet have been writing about this, documenting this. So when you talk about climate change impacts and the issues that we face, you have to talk about gender. You have to talk about how even within our communities, people are affected unequally. So when I've traveled to different parts of the world, these are the types of things that Indigenous people are saying everywhere about what they're experiencing with respect to climate change. And I'm not going to go over this in detail, but it ranges from things like relocation and economic damage at one end of the spectrum, but then down at the bottom, it gets into issues about the very fabric of our society. If you and your grandparents are out doing some activity, if you're out fishing, if you're out gathering, and those are things that strengthen your relationship with your grandparents, and those facilitate language learning, understanding of cultural norms, and other practices. If it becomes harder to do those things because the landscape has changed, the ecosystem has changed, then actually it begins to disentangle the fabric of your society. And those are things that are very hard to replace. So while it's true that if Native people were extremely adaptive, when another human group imposes rapid adaptation on another, it makes it so that you incur harms that you wouldn't normally have incurred. And so this is kind of one basic understanding of what climate justice means. And just like Vine Deloria, I think in one of his books, I can't remember which one, said that whenever you start seeing the anthropologists pop up in their khaki shorts and things like that, that time is running out. Well, we figured out what to do with the anthropologists, but now, right, the climate scientists are confirming all these things that Native people have known about climate change, and now they're reporting these things. And so now it's almost the same thing, right? That once the climate scientists finally catch on to what's going on, time is running out. And so you're seeing report after report by the climate scientists actually talking about how Native people are going to be hit hardest by climate change, and how there's all sorts of things impacting Native people everywhere that are of the most serious nature. In fact, it's so serious that I argue that climate change impacts what I would call our collective continuance as Native people, our capacity to adapt and to flourish as a society that supports each other, that supports one another, that supports plants and animals and humans within one society, because it's so rapid. And in particular, what I see climate change doing is, remember earlier in the presentation when I was talking about our seasonal systems and that they were based on mutual moral responsibilities? Well, those relationships, right, those responsibilities that sustain our societies, that are part of the fabric of our societies or our collective continuance, those moral relationships are good ones when they're based on trust and they're based on what I call redundancy, right, or when they're strong. And so to give you a couple of examples of that, right, say, in a society where you're having to face relocation, if people in your society don't get along, then that relocation process is not going to go very well, right? It's going to be a difficult decision-making process. People are going to be at odds against each other. So for our societies that have already been through so much and are already having to deal with so many internal issues that we face, something like climate change then adds to that stress. It adds to that pressure and can make it so that it actually causes greater distrust within our societies. Or take redundancy, right? Redundancy refers to the idea, and we can think about it historically, that back in the day, a lot of the types of impacts that we're dealing with now with respect to climate change would have been easy to adapt to. Historically, if a fish population moved, we fished all over the Great Lakes. We just moved where we went fishing. But because of colonialism, it's reduced to places where we can go fishing, hence it's reduced our redundancy so that a climate change impact occurs on top of that and is harder to deal with because we have less redundancy. So the idea is that when we think of our collective continuance as people, when we think about the fabric of our society, those moral relationships are built on very important things, including trust, redundancy, and other things, if we were talking longer, that I would also share that are part of this. So this is why, at least from my perspective as a Potawatomi person, climate change is an issue of the highest seriousness. Now I want to talk about a couple of things that we're doing and that I'm part of in the work that I do. And so I kind of divide the work that I do in terms of two things. So one I call knowledge sovereignty, and the other I sort of call climate justice, though it's all about climate justice. So knowledge sovereignty, right, refers to the idea that when we are figuring out what to do about climate change, our own knowledge is a really good source of information about what's happening. So for example, there's a great peer-reviewed literature out there now talking about just how much as Indigenous people we know about climate change. So there's folks in the Arctic, such as this one, that talk about how Inuits and other groups up there, they can figure out whether wind is changing using all sorts of variables that scientists don't think of, like plant and animal movements and what the snow is like. Anishinaabe folks, right? We have very fine-grained capacity to observe change. And in this study done by a couple of friends of mine, they were pointing out that when climate scientists and forestry scientists were asking Anishinaabe people about how do you guys monitor birch bark, when do you know that birch bark is good or bad? And the Anishinaabe people were like, we don't look at good or bad, we look at a number of varieties of birch bark, right, that vary based on what you need it for, right? So it doesn't make sense to talk about good and bad. And so this is a very fine-grained way of monitoring the environment. Or Navajo people have been for years and years and years keeping track of drought conditions and have knowledge going back a long, long time about what things were like so that you can use that knowledge to figure out how rapid the changes are today. And scientists who have never lived there would have no idea about what that history was. Only people that have lived in that region. And it even goes deeper, right? I don't know if you all have seen this, the Lakota winter counts, it's online. And these folks were keeping track going way back of big events that happened every year, documenting them. And a lot of scientists are realizing, well, wait a minute, stuff that we've figured out happened a couple hundred years ago, they were already keeping track of. And many of these are physical, natural, climatic type events. So as Indigenous people, we know a ton of stuff about climate change, but you guys know what happens whenever other people find out that we know something, right? They want to grab it, right? They want to take it. They generally don't like it when we benefit from that. And so the Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Working Group, which was started by tribal college students and some great tribal college student leaders, including Paulette Blanchard, they formed a group to try to figure out, is it possible for scientists and tribes to work together to better understand climate change? And so they have a meeting every couple of years. Again, it's twice a year. Again, it's entirely run by tribal college students. And one of the things that they really turned me on to is something that I'd been thinking about but wasn't quite able to articulate, but that our knowledge of climate change is not actually just data. It's not just facts about, oh, this is different from what it was before, or this is the same. It's actually knowledge about how to live sustainably, right? It's knowledge about how to structure your social institutions, your political institutions, your economic institutions in ways that are less likely to fall prey to what we've seen happen with capitalism, with industrialization. And so my friend Shannon McNeely, who works at the Koyukon, right, she constructed, right, this with them, this seasonal wheel, which is similar, right, to when we think about Anishinaabe seasonal rounds. It's a whole idea of how your society, your culture, your economy, your politics are built to be as best in line as possible with the dynamics of ecosystems. And that's a completely different vision of sustainability, of resilience, than we see with that other one out there that's sort of screwing things up. Now, when scientists don't acknowledge, right, that this is the case about our knowledge, then they treat us as subjects that just provide data. So knowledge sovereignty involves a couple of different projects, right? So one of the first projects that it involves is actually then doing what we can to protect our knowledge from scientific exploitation. And so there's been a number of groups that have formed. So there's a Federal Advisory Committee on Climate Change and Natural Resource Science. There's kind of a tribal group that I'm part of. And we've put in reports policies for protection of traditional knowledge, which then are disseminated and scientists read them and are should abide by them. There's also been groups like the Climate and Traditional Knowledges Work Group, which is formed of Native people of lots of different tribes, tribal leaders, some Native scholars, to actually develop guidelines and a literature on how to protect Indigenous knowledge from exploitation by climate scientists. And so this group, which I'm also part of, has produced literature and guidelines. We've got a website that has tons of information and resources on this topic of improving collaboration between climate scientists and tribes. Another group, the Rising Voices of Indigenous People in Climate Science, they took on the tactic that it's not just about like teaching scientists principles, because they can just not follow the principles, right? They don't have to follow those things. Actually, scientists need to get a better idea of what it's like to completely transform their science from a Native perspective. So what Rising Voices does, which is really unique, is they meet once a year at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. This year, by the way, it's in a new location. It's in Hawaii. But typically, it's been at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And what the organizers of this event do is they take that scientific space and they transform it as best they can into a ceremonial space. So when scientists walk into their own institution, it's totally transformed. It's totally different from what they would understand. So then when you have that dialogue about Indigenous knowledge and climate science, it's done on different terms, right? The actual, and you can see, right, with these titles for conferences, learning and doing education, adaptation through diverse ways of knowing. This is not a typical title of a scientific conference at a major scientific research center. But also that's considered to not be enough. It's not enough just for scientists to have their own space transformed. That's giving us too much work to do. Scientists also have to show up like in our reservations and in our nations. And so the Sustainable Development Institute at the College of Menominee Nation has worked very hard to create conferences and events and other activities that scientists can actually come to Menominee and see what's going on in that environment, understand the significance of traditional knowledge and especially Indigenous knowledge of climate change for tribes. So the Menominee, first of all, they invented their own model of sustainability because they weren't a huge fan of the other ones that didn't represent their experience. And based on what other Native people had done going back to the 90s in terms of organizing workshops to connect tribes and climate scientists, they've organized a number of workshops. So this is one that I was part of organizing called Shifting Seasons. And instead of the typical science conference, right, this one starts off properly, right? You get immersed in the Menominee Nation, which is one of the coolest places in the Great Lakes. Starts off with some music, ceremonially. And then it's based on dialogue. You can see Deb McGregor hanging out there. Deb, you gave the best comments of that whole session. Just wanted to say. And so here, right, it's about dialogue within a tribal context and completely changes what scientists think. So that's a lot about scientists. Knowledge sovereignty isn't only about them. But also within our tribes, a lot of times we don't have our act together, right? We've got great traditions to draw from, but we don't necessarily have any more of those internal networks for sharing the knowledge, recording the knowledge, and actually using it. So my friends at Menominee, including Marie Schaefer, is a tribal college student at Michigan State University, have worked hard to organize teams who would work with specific tribes on their climate change plans. So we were inspired by tribes like the Swinomish that took leadership in actually developing a climate change plan, which had within it a knowledge sovereignty plan about how they're going to mobilize their own knowledge resources. And so this is one of the teams that we formed, so it's tribal folks. And we've worked then with tribes that then create plans that are guided by their traditional knowledge and a plan for how to work with that as the primary guidance for what you're going to do in relation to climate change in addition to science. And what we found doing this work is that a lot of tribes in the Great Lakes, to figure out how to deal with climate change, they go back to what they know about their seasonal system, right, their 13 moons system, and they try to put it in practice. So here, for example, in Ottawassipi Potawatomi, they've been recently recreating their rice camps. And so a couple of great students, Carla Dillon and Isa Gayard, they worked with them then to make sure that those rice camps were also addressing climate change, right? So not only about rice harvesting, but how to protect the rice harvest in the future due to changes in the environment. The Little River Band of Odawa in Michigan, they understand resilience and adaptation to future change in terms of actually restoring particular plants and animals like sturgeon that were kind of bedrocks of those social, cultural, and political systems that were highly adapted. So they actually see that trying to restore a native species, right, then is the basis for beginning to create, again, more flexible institutions, ecological change. It's also a good way for educating members of the settler society in terms of what their responsibilities are to Indigenous people that are now their, or that they're now our neighbors. And so this is a public ceremony that they do that's about sturgeon and resilience and so on. So these are some of the things that are going on, at least kind of in my neck of the woods, regarding knowledge sovereignty. The other aspect of what I do then addresses more of these political and policy issues, so what I call climate justice. And so climate justice refers to this idea that we're, as Indigenous people, the hardest hit by climate change, but we hardly contributed to it at all, right? I mean, like barely any. Yeah, we do things that impact the environment, but compared to like industrialization, global capitalism, like this big, right? And so we've been realizing that this has to change. And so Indigenous people have really been mobilizing to address this issue of climate justice. So one of the groups, for example, is the First Steward Symposium. They meet every 2 years in Washington, D.C. To try to sway Congress to change their policy of climate change and really understand that Congress has a great responsibility to Native people because we didn't cause this stuff, right? And so it's a big crowd, lots of political people, and seeks to build awareness among policymakers about the specific ways in which we're impacted by climate change. Another thing we found, right, is that when the United States create policy, or even when tribes create their own climate change policies, we still think in these Western ways, right? So that we oftentimes don't do things like understand that gender is fundamental to climate change adaptation, that women's lives, for example, are fundamental to climate change adaptation. So we've also been working then to actually create literature that requires, right, at the policy level, a responsiveness to Native ways of thinking about climate change. This is a report I was part of on gender and climate vulnerability for Native communities. And one of the things we found is that when the Forest Service or U.S. agency publishes one of these reports, the glossary, when it's adopted, becomes like part of the policy language, so they have to use it. And so what we did is we just totally messed with them and made it so that it reflected how a lot of Native people think about it. So now the Forest Service has to accept terms like this, intersectionality, LGBTQ, LGBTQ, transgender, patriarchy, two-spirit, right? All terms are key to climate change, and this has been an important document for a lot of tribal leaders, because one of the things that I've found working with different tribes is because we've had to deal with these governments that were imposed on us, the federally recognized, tribal governments, the Indian Reorganization Act governments, is because those are occupied, the staff and the leadership, primarily by dudes, that oftentimes their approaches to climate change completely miss what women are doing, what people with different genders are doing. I mean, they miss all sorts of things, right, when you just have that sort of male perspective. And so for a lot of tribes, what's been blocking them from doing successful climate change adaptation plans is precisely that they're excluding huge numbers of people in the tribe that aren't gendered as male in a Western sense. And so it's very hard to actually accept the idea that there's some way of achieving sovereignty with respect to climate change that is more fundamental than addressing internal patriarchy within our communities, right? So that they're both equally as fundamental, sovereignty and resistance to patriarchy. And so you've also seen, out of these different policy groups that have formed, this was a little bit hard to hone in on, groups like National Congress of American Indians forwarding principles for adaptation to climate change and for dealing with climate justice issues like stopping the fossil fuel industry and lessening it. You can see things like emphasizing the importance of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And email me or check out my website for Michigan State if you want to get any of these documents, and there's big literature that's relevant to policy as well. And Indigenous people all over the world are talking about the same things. This is 32 Indigenous folks that came together last summer through the UN Institute for Training and Research, everywhere, right? All of them talking about climate change issues that affect them, climate justice issues. And so these meetings are constantly occurring. Not everybody understands the jokes that I tell, but that did not prevent us from having a good conversation. And then finally, before I get into a little philosophy and then conclude, all of the stuff that's going on then has really motivated us to think about, well, what kind of education do we need so that people like myself that maybe a long time ago wanted to take leadership in climate change but didn't have the mentorship to do so, how can we change that? So I've been part of some initiatives as well. This one's happening in a couple of weeks. It's called the Tribal Climate Camp. It's education for young tribal environmental professionals who've been tasked with developing a climate change plan within their tribe to understand it not only as a technical activity involving climate science, but an activity that encompasses everything that happens in the tribe, young people, elders, guided by traditional knowledge. Another thing we do, we've been doing every year is the Indigenous Planning Summer Institute. This is part of the flyer for this year. I work with Menominee on this. It's for tribal college students that want to understand how they can be involved in Indigenous planning and planning for the future of their tribe, climate change being a huge part of that. That happens next week. I should probably prepare for that. This is one of our cohorts from last year. Okay, so I've got about 6 minutes, and I want to share with you in that time period a couple of philosophical ideas about this. So with respect to climate justice, what's really kind of pissed me off recently is, non-native people, settlers, others, they know that we're going to be hit harder by climate change, and it's not because they were listening to us a long time ago. It's because their scientists finally said so. But they don't understand why it is. So like a friend of mine, I'm not going to blame him, he was summarizing some literature, but he wrote, right, climate change wreaks the greatest havoc and destruction on the lives of the global poor. So this includes Indigenous people, right? So people in that category. Partly as a result of nothing more than geographical bad luck. Many of the global poor happen to live in locales that will be most susceptible to the consequences of increasing global temperatures. To me, when I looked at that, I was like, that just sounds like some, advice you get from members of the Settler Society, right? Like, don't worry, the other stuff was deliberate, but the stuff now, that's just bad luck, right? And I was like, what they're doing here is they're making a big mistake, right? They're saying, okay, there's capitalism and industrialization, which is the root of climate change, because that's what puts the emissions in the atmosphere. So that's one history, right, that we're part of. And that starts with, the beginning of settlement and colonialism. And they're saying that that's not related to colonialism, right? Which is what renders us living in these locations that are more susceptible to climate change, and it renders us living in conditions that make it harder to adapt, right? So they're separate, they're not related. So climate change is just an issue of capitalism and industrialization, but it's not an issue of colonialism. And so therefore it's okay to say that it's all about bad luck. And when they think it's about bad luck, right, then they don't think they're as responsible as they really are for changing their behavior and activity. So in my work, I've really tried to show that if actually you think very carefully about colonialism and what it does, then you realize that there's no bad luck at all, and that members of the settler society that live today are just as responsible as their own ancestors for climate change. And so they can't get out of it. They can't say, oh, our ancestors were the ones that put the fossil fuel stuff in there, increased the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. They didn't know what they were doing at the time. So I want to argue if you consider colonialism, you have to accept that they did know what they were doing, and that people in current settler populations and others actually subscribe to a lot of the same policies, right? So let me just give you some examples before I conclude. So the first thing to note, right, is that the only reason why these impacts hit us hard is because of all of the past destruction of colonialism, right? So the reason why climate change is an additional threat to, say, black ash trees is because Michigan was already completely deforested, right? So it destroyed the redundancy and the amount of locations where we could gather that plant in the first place, right? So that you, first of all, colonialism is always there as a layer, right, that makes climate change harder to adapt to. Pollution is the same thing, right? The reason why there's less fishing locations partly is because so much of the water is polluted, and that wasn't something that happened with climate change. I was saying it happened a long time ago. So that the reason why it will impact the fishery more heavily is because it was already impacted heavily by other things that were part of settler colonialism. And then finally, right, for tribes like mine, relocation is not actually something that's new, right? Tribes have been relocated repeatedly. So even tribes that are on reservations, that is actually in their homelands, that actually is a form of relocation because they shrunk a larger territory into a tiny territory. So if you look at colonialism, right, you know, you have to understand that the reason why the impacts are harder in the first place is because climate change impacts today sound a lot like things that have happened repeatedly over time. Right? Like you can't fish there anymore. That sounds kind of familiar. Right? It totally is. But it's even worse, and this is where you get into the responsibility. When I started thinking about it more, it's not just that colonialism did the same things, it's even more insidious than that. Because what settler colonialism can be understood as is a form of inflicting environmental and climate change on our people through policies that work very strategically. So if you look actually at the pattern of settler colonialism, you see something that's particularly disturbing. The same policies that removed our people and shrunk our land area and that box us in, okay, those policies were designed to clear us out of the way for what? The industries that brought us anthropogenic climate change. But then if you think about the examples I was giving you before about what Native people are saying about how they're affected by climate change, it's because they can't fully adapt so well without being harmed because they're boxed in. So the same policies that brought us anthropogenic climate change or human-caused climate change are the ones that make it harder to adapt. They're not any different, right? There's not a history that brought us climate change that is somehow separate from the history that makes it harder for us to adapt. So consider a couple of brief examples before I close. I mean, if you look at, say, the village of Shishmaref, and they're confined to this tiny island, and they're going to have to consider very seriously relocation. I've almost decided to do so recently because that little island is susceptible to sea level rise. Historically, they ranged in a much larger area. Sea level rise wouldn't have actually been a problem. But in order to help open up Alaska and the Arctic for extractive industries, the US forced them onto that little island. So it makes it harder for them to adapt now that they're permanently settled, right? Because once you're permanently settled and get used to that, it's hard to permanently settle somewhere else than it would be if you were in a much larger area and could range and were mobile and so on. And so literally the exact same policy that cleared some of the land for the emergence of extractive industries is the one that also makes it harder for them to adapt. Or consider, for example, the treaty tribes in Washington State in the Pacific Northwest, right? Their argument is that it's harder to adapt to climate change because the US doesn't respect the treaty relation in the way that the tribes understood it. But they're also arguing that if the US did respect the treaty relation, they could use that to block the shipments of fossil fuels, right, from the major extraction basins in the US. So their argument is that the US's disrespect for treaty rights is what opened up the land for extractive industries, and the US disrespect for their treaty rights or lack of full fulfillment of them is what makes it harder to protect salmon and other plants and animals that are important to them. So this is why climate justice is actually fully about decolonization. Don't let anyone tell you it's about bad luck. And all of the stuff we've already been doing to address colonization is also addressing climate change. So we cannot continue to say things like we just need to change our lifestyles to cut our burning of gas and things like that. That's not enough. You have to have decolonization all the way through of how we address climate justice, or else our communities will still be subject to the same vicious patterns of environmental change that climate change is only a recent episode of.